The seventh session on the social teachings of the Church and political science will deal with the global economy. 32 million people control 41% of the world's wealth. If we had to look at slide 3, we realize that the countries on the Northern Hemisphere, Europe, Northern America, and the countries that are close to them have amassed wealth which far exceeds the wealth of the remaining countries in the Southern Hemisphere. Africa, South America, Asia, which clearly have a significantly less level of wealth than the northern countries. Why have we created a world with such inequalities? And today's session will effectively deal with the global inequalities, with the issues emanating from development and solidarity, and also the role of the financial markets in the global world. If we had to look at the wealth pyramid, we immediately realize the huge disparity between the few billionaires. There are 1,844 billionaires estimated in 2014, from a world population which today is about 7.7 billion. A lot of people live with a wage of lower than $2 per day, approximately 1 billion people. Why do we have such a huge disparity in the global wealth? The number of adults, 36 million, earn over 1 million a year, but over 3.5 million earn not more than $10,000 a year. This is the huge disparity that exists in the world economy. And this is something of great concern to the Church that comes out from its teachings. Let's look at some countries. Inequalities in countries. Russia. The inequality gene, which is the measure that measures how much the top earners are far from the bottom earners, Russia tops this list, 74%. India, 58%. Thailand, 58%. Indonesia, 49%. Brazil, 48%. China, 43%. Despite being a communist country where supposedly people are more equal. The United States, with all its wealth, the income disparity is of 42%. South Africa, 41%. Mexico, 38%. Clearly, one realizes that the disparity among nations is indeed significant, not just globally, when you compare one country to another, but also within a country, the rich in a country from the poor in a country. The World Bank, which is an international organization that seeks to fight poverty, in the first Millennium Development Goals established in 1990, had targeted to halve the world's poverty by 2015. And this was effectively achieved in 2010. However, according to recent estimates, what we are observing is that while in a number of regions poverty has decreased, in some regions poverty has not changed. It has remained at a high level, particularly in the case of Africa, where actually poverty increased by 9 million to more than 510 million people living in poverty. And therefore we realize that when we look at the world population, 10% of the world population, which is approximately 736 million people, still earn less than $2 a day. Now, I don't know if $3 a day will make you a richer person. So probably there are more people who can really be considered to be poor by our standards, but are not measured as poor today. But those that earn less than $2 a day are effectively estimated to reach over 700 million people. Why this poverty? And the World Bank tries to assess this and comes up with a number of reasons. First of all, it has observed that the largest areas of poverty are countries or regions which are very dependent on rural economies. Usually people there are poorly educated. There are many times a lot of workers are even under the age of 18, so there are a lot of child labor involved in these areas. These economies are very fragile and in remote areas, and therefore access to water, infrastructure, communications is not there. And also, when you see progress in these regions, they are very vulnerable. So they may start moving out of poverty, but then you have a big hurricane or a storm or a national disaster of some sort, and they return to being poor. So there are people who are trapped many times in this poverty. But there are reasons why these people are trapped in this poverty, because clearly the governments in those countries are not taking decisive, active measures as national governments and the international community, as we will see later, to address the inequalities in these regions and to address poverty. And there are a number of reasons, and I can say that in Italian there is a phrase, tutto il mondo è un paese, so really these problems are faced by every nation to a level of degree. But the first issue that you note in the very poor countries is mismanagement and corruption at the government level. So you realize that the state is hijacked by a number of people who are corrupt, who will therefore use national resources to their interest and the interest of those who protect them rather than to the nation at large. This we see primarily also or fundamentally in dictatorships or democracy that looks more like a dictatorship than a democracy, who really invest a lot of their money in military power. So you see countries, very big countries, powerful countries, you can talk of India, China, but also countries in Africa, where there's still a lot of poverty, but they claim to be military powers because they've invested a lot in their military personnel. Why? Because the military helps them hold on to the power internally, and therefore they can quash any revolts and remain at the helm of the resources of that country. We see, however, also problems in countries with democracies because politicians tend to favor politics of populism rather than necessarily the politics that really addresses the issues of the poor. And so they focus their attention on areas where they will get votes. And therefore, if you do not influence the vote, then that area is not given its importance. The role of multinationals in the global economy. Unfortunately, as also the World Bank list of corrupt multinational companies grows, and some what we think are very reputable international companies have been found foul by the World Bank of corrupt practices in a number of countries, are through illegitimate and less legitimate means extracting resources from the poorer countries at very cheap prices and then selling them on the international market at huge profits so that on the stock exchanges, as we will see later, their share price continues to grow. And therefore, these multinational companies are increasing this problem in the world because they are themselves incentivizing corrupt governments to remain in corruption. The issue of global tax avoidance, which is therefore denying the poorer countries the right to claim tax on the profits being made on the resources extracted from their countries, and also the global economic system itself, which is very much based on more and more free trade without the adequate compensation measures to ensure that the profits made, the benefits made from the trading activity are actually trickling effectively to everyone in society. Clearly, the global economic system is far from the social teachings of the Church. This year, the Church has actually issued a document, a specific document dealing with the economies and matters related to the economies. And this document actually speaks of the speed by which inequalities are growing in a number of countries and how more people are living in conditions of extreme poverty. So although the number of people who may be classified as poor globally has went down, those that have remained in poverty are in situations of grave extreme poverty. And as the Pope says, time is running out. We cannot leave these people in this situation. In fact, in Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis says the following: just as the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," sets a clear limit in order to safeguard the value of human life, today we also have to say, "Thou shalt not," to an economy of exclusion and inequality. Such an economy kills. So the Pope actually takes the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," and reminds the economy, the people who are responsible for the economy, because there are people responsible for the economy, that it is their duty not to kill or not to allow the economy to kill the poor and the people who are disadvantaged. And he asks the question, how can we be concerned with the news that the stock market price fell by 2% and not of that elderly person, homeless, who dies on the street? But in reality, in our news, we're more concerned about what happens to the prices on the markets than what is happening to individual people on the street. And he says, can we continue to stand by when food is thrown away while people are starving? This is a case of inequality. He says, as a consequence, masses of people find themselves excluded and marginalized, without work, without possibilities, without any means of escape. And therefore, there is a global responsibility to address these issues of inequalities at a global level. Why? Because the Church again reaffirms the fundamental principle of the universal common good. Because when the world was created, the world was not created for few, but was created for all of humanity. And therefore, like national economies, the global economy cannot be left to run merely on the principles of the free market. Internationally, the Church urges governments to globally collaborate to be able to address poverty. And it is positive, and the Church looks very positively at these multinational organizations like the United Nations, the World Bank, the World Health Organizations, and other similar organizations who have been created by governments precisely to take active measures to address these inequalities. And in fact, the Catechism of the Catholic Church specifically says that the unity of the human family, embracing people who enjoy equal natural dignity, implies a universal common good. And it goes on to actually emphasizing the need of having these world organizations that can work interdependently to foster development in less developed countries. Because for the Church, development is a right. Humanity is there to flourish, and the responsibility of states is to ensure that humanity flourishes. But to flourish, you have to move out, first of all, of poverty, to be given opportunities to educate yourself, to have health systems that take care of your health, and therefore there's a lot to do. And as the Church says in one of his documents, and John Paul II says, it may seem that underdevelopment is impossible to eliminate. At times people tell you, well, poverty will always be there, as though we don't need to make much effort, because in any case, poverty will be there. But the Church does not agree with that thesis. It says, as though it were a death sentence, especially considering the fact that it is not only the result of erroneous human choices. So poverty is not just because governments make mistakes, but also the consequence of economic, financial and social mechanisms. So the real problem lies that the global socio-economic model that we have adapted is not responding to the needs of everyone, but is merely focusing resources on the few rather than on the many, as we saw in the earlier slides. And also Pope Paul VI emphasizes this in Populorum Progressio, where he says, it follows that every man has the right to glean what he needs from the earth. Every man has a right to feed from the earth. And therefore, he says, God intended the earth and everything in it for the use of all human beings and people. Thus, under the leadership of justice and in the company of charity, created goods should flow fairly to all. So it is only social justice and the value of charity that compels us to take every step necessary to ensure that we eradicate poverty. All other rights, whatever they may be, including the rights of property and free trade, are to be subordinate to this principle. So what the Church is saying is, while it upholds the right of private property and the good and the positive of free trade, these cannot be at the exclusion of humanity. And they are there for the service of humanity. And therefore, there is an urgent social duty, as the Pope says, to address these issues. So, as the compendium says, the magisterium sees development as a right. And it is right under the following 5 principles: unity of origin and the shared destiny of human family. So the world has a shared destiny. As humanity, we share our destiny together in this world. Equality, we are all equal, but as we've seen in the initial slides, the world doesn't show that we are all equal. There are many who are, or a few who are more equal than others. The universal destination of goods, the principle we have so many times touched upon, that the goods of the world are for everyone to benefit from. The notion of development in its entirety, so development, the individual development, we need to develop people to be able to take care of themselves. And centrally is the human person and solidarity. So this is what the Church teaches about the right of development and therefore the effort that is needed internationally to address these issues. So what are some ideas of effectively need to be done to ensure that this happens? There is obviously a lot that needs to be done, both at an international level and at a national level. At national levels primarily, we need to strengthen good government and eradicate corruption. This is not easy, but at times the global realities are not helping to foster this culture. As long as dictatorships keep finding governments that are willing to sell them weapons, to buy from them cheaply resources, there is no reason why that government formation, dictatorship, will move out. Because the people have no ability to overturn that government, because that government is very strong, it has weapons, so it has an army, so it can control the nation. And that government has no obligation to respond to people because he is fed internationally through this global corruption. So when governments sell weapons to dictatorship and take resources cheaply from that government, that too is a form of corruption, even though it may be done within the international law framework. So a fundamental issue is stopping the sales of weapons to these sort of governments. Now, that's a big issue for a number of rich countries that invest a lot in military hardware and have a lot of factories and a lot of jobs. They want to sell the military equipment they produce. And to sell military equipment, there has to be a purpose. There has to be conflicts, there has to be war. Otherwise, governments will not consume weaponry. And this shows you the contradiction. So while in the world we talk about peace, stability, eradicating the poor, development, at the same time, these countries which are facing these problems are being riddled with the greed of the richer countries who want to sell weapons and take the resources cheaply. And therefore, the third principle is that there needs to be a fair compensation for the resources extracted. It is very unfair and unjust that we are actually taking resources from poor countries like Africa, even countries in South America that have resources, at very cheap financial payment. So these countries remain in poverty to benefit the already richer countries. Let me give you just one example. Congo. In Congo, Congo produces what is called cobalt. Cobalt is that material which goes into lithium, and lithium is used for our smartphones and a lot of gadgets which have screens, because it is what powers the batteries. This cobalt in Congo is extracted by children 8 to 11 years old who are paid $1 a day in mines that are detrimental to their health, because there is health issues in relation to this substance, and the world is silent. Companies buy this cobalt from these illegal companies that are formed to pay to extract this material, and the world is silent because we don't want to pay more phones. But where are the profits going for these tablets and for these old smartphones? In companies that are making huge profits in the developed countries. While in Congo, children aged 8 to 11 and 12, 13, rather than going to schools, are in these fields, in these mines, gathering this material. This is clearly grossly unjust. We also need to ensure genuine development aid. Why do I say genuine development aid? Because a lot of the development aid that goes into poor countries is conditional. I will build you roads as long as contractors from my country build it. So in reality, you're not creating jobs in the country that is poor. The poor in that country are remaining jobless because the jobs are being done while the road is being built in I don't know which country in Africa by contractors coming from a European country. That is not genuine development aid. Genuine development aid goes to genuinely not only develop the infrastructure of the country, but also the people in that country. I mentioned multinational companies. There clearly needs to be more control on multinational companies to ensure that the resources they extract, they pay a fair compensation to that country. And I believe also on an international level, organizations like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, or also regional organizations, should support poorer countries in developing national development plans that focus on job creation, factories, infrastructure, education, sanitary, water, the basic needs of that country. And if that country has resources, the resources are used to finance those requirements and not, again, sold cheaply and then supposedly assisting these countries through development aid. When you look at the disparity between losses made in Africa and development aid, you realize there's a huge disparity. So Africa has resources that could amount for $60 billion per year. They lose that to these multinational companies, and then other countries give approximately $20 billion back in terms of development aid. That is crazy. They already had the $60 billion. But we have not allowed them to use it to be developed in their own countries. And therefore, development plans can help to accelerate economic growth, ensure that the population benefits from those resources, develop infrastructure, human development, water, education, health, create the social systems that are necessary, and also use development aid effectively. But there is also another aspect which the Church mentions on development, which is population control. It is amazing how globally the United Nations, as one of the measures that it advocates to eradicate poverty, is population control. And population control is advocated through abortion. And this is also a contradiction in itself. Because as the Church says, and as Pope Francis says in Laudato Si, clause 50, some can only propose solutions for poverty through a reduction in birth rate. At times, developing countries face forms of international pressure which make economic assistance contingent to reproductive rights. So what does the modern world, the rich world, tell the poor world? You have a lot of poor people. We need to solve your poverty. I will give you development aid as long as you introduce abortion in your country. So we reduce the population. What sort of logic is that? That is not development aid. The development is there to support the population to grow, to flourish, not to kill the population through abortion. And clearly, Pope Francis comes strongly against this notion. He says to blame population growth instead of extreme and selective consumerism on the part of some is in one way of refusing to face the issues. So to not face the issues as a developed world are obligations to support the development of the less developed world. We throw the problem at them and tell them, solve your problem, reduce your population, introduce abortion, contraception, and all these sort of measures to mitigate population growth. This is grossly unfair. There's also an issue of debt reduction. A lot of the countries that are underdeveloped have a lot of debt. They have a lot of resources, but have a lot of debt. The profits of the resources are taken by the multinational companies, and they are left with that debt. And with that debt, they are ransomed. They remain, therefore, unable to really come up of their issues. And again, this is something that the Church condemns. While, yes, it is the obligation of states to pay back their debt, but if the debt has grown to immeasurable proportions that it is really hurting society and is born out of injustice, then clearly there is an obligation also from the richer states to forgive certain level of debts of the poorer countries. As I said, the financial markets also contribute to poverty. And the Church clearly expressed its concern from the beginning of the development of the concept of the international financial markets. Even John Paul II in 1988 in Sollecitudo dei Socialis says that the acceleration of the situation of wealth for some and the poverty of the rest is being caused by this new form of capitalism moving through the financial markets. And these mechanisms, I quote, which are maneuvered directly or indirectly by the more developed countries, because we know that financial markets, which are the markets where companies buy and where people can buy shares on these large companies, okay, by their very function favor the interests of the people, manipulating them. In the end, they suffocate or condition the economies of the less developed countries. So what is happening? The financial markets are suffocating the poorer countries. Why? Because people who buy shares in companies today are not really concerned what the companies are doing. Their only real concern is the share price. Is the share price going up or down? Obviously, investors want the share price to go up. For the share price to go up, companies need to make more profits, need to grow more. At some point, that growth cannot be sustained at the level that these shareholders expect. So the pressure on the companies is to make more profit even if they had to do it with illegitimate means, as is happening with a lot of multinational companies in these poorer countries. And this is why there is this trap. And precisely it is this trap that the Church is trying to break. This year, as I said, the Church has issued a very important document under Pope Francis from the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, which specifically speaks about the integral human development, called Economic and Financial Issues. And this document rejects the false notions that economies are morally neutral. Economics is not morally neutral. Economics has an effect on people and therefore needs morality, as we've seen in previous presentations. And therefore the key message of this document is that the economic markets must be appropriately regulated and based on a clear ethical foundation. Pope Francis in 2015, in the encyclical letter Laudate Si, says, politics must not be subject to the economy, nor should the economy be subject to the dictates of an efficiency-driven paradigm of technocracy. Today, in view of the common good, there is an urgent need for politics and economics to enter into a frank dialogue in the service of life, especially human life. Now remember, this is after the crisis, and the Pope says, saving banks at any costs and making the public pay the price, while foregoing a firm commitment to reviewing and reforming the entire system, only reaffirms the absolute power of a financial system, a power which has no future and will only give rise to new crises after a slow, costly and only apparent recovery. So the Pope says, it was fine to save the banks, to save the economy, but why did the banks fail? If we are not going to address the issues that underlined the financial collapse, we will only face it again. And we know that the international financial collapse in 2009, when Lehman Brothers and a lot of other international banks collapsed, had one cause, and that was greed. Economic greed by a few who only wanted to make profits at the cost of everyone else. So, as the Pope says, our relationship with money has today become dominion over ourselves and society. He talks of this new idolatry. Money has become a god in itself. Rather than a service to humanity, I use the term the blood veins to make an economy function, it actually has become the new god. So money, consumption has become the root cause of the problems in our society, because there is a complete imbalance, the Pope says, of ideologies which defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation. So today, financial speculation, we defend it because we say we don't want to intervene in the free market. But we know that financial speculation has been the cause of the disaster for a lot of countries with the international economic collapse. The problem also is that markets, and the document goes a lot of detail, it's a very interesting document, actually one of the few documents of the social teachings of the Church that really focuses in detail on the aspects of the economy and the financial markets. But it identifies the key problems that need to be addressed. First of all, that with the privatization of companies and stock exchanges, so where you buy and sell these shares and instruments, because today there are a lot more instruments than just shares in companies, destroyed the public purpose of stock exchanges, which were intended initially merely to raise capital for the good of a company to create products. Today they have become an end in themselves, a business in themselves. So they are not really concerned with what companies are really producing, but merely on the volumes. So it's all about increasing volumes of buying and selling and activity without there being reason. Today there are prices of companies, big companies, the Amazons of this world, these huge companies. When you see their share price and the value of the company, you start asking the question, but what backs that value? Does really that company worth those billions? And in reality, it's not really substantiated in the economic value of the company, but more it's a speculative price. People will continue paying a higher price for those shares irrespective, and that is merely speculation. And therefore, there is a misalignment between shareholder wealth maximization and what the company is effectively earning. And therefore, we are not really concerned with the true value of the company, but rather with the value of the share price, which at all costs we wanted to increase irrespective. Then we've seen, as the document says, a lot of new innovative market products that a lot of common people don't understand. Securitization, hedge funds, funds of funds, asset-backed securities, credit default swaps, derivatives, stock options, short selling, all these products that people are encouraged to buy, but very few people are able to understand. And then we find a lot of financial advisors pushing people to buy these products, and then they realize that these people don't understand these products. Something happens in the market, it collapses, and they end up without savings. So the church says there needs to be a lot of regulation, because in reality today in a lot of international stock exchanges, it's not about buying and selling of shares. Many times the spirit of gambling has come in to this industry. Conflict of interest. Managers have an interest to see the company make short-term gains rather than long-term sustainability projects. Why? Because the share price is influenced by the profits made in every quarter, so they will take short-term decisions, which may harm the company in the future, but merely for the share price to be higher so that they can receive their bonuses, their compensation, which in reality has been part and parcel of the collapse. The collapse in the banking system has come because of these bonus structures management and banks internationally had, where profits superseded the viability of the bank itself. And therefore, they were more interested in bonuses than in actually running properly the banking system. Information and misinformation. Today a lot of fake news comes out, even on companies, precisely to influence the share price. And the misalignment of interests. So I go to an investment advisor, a person who is not knowledgeable. I go there asking him, what are the products suitable for me? And he actually says me something which is not suitable, because for him that gives him the largest commission. So he convinces me to buy something not in my interest but in his interest, because that earns him commission. And that again the church talks about this misalignment of interests, and therefore talks about the need to control this sphere. That governments have a responsibility internationally. And there has been a lot of effort even coming into this area in a number of countries, internationally, in the European Union and other regions, to control these sort of realities, because it is clear, the church says in this document, that markets, as powerful propellers of the economy, are not capable of governing themselves. We cannot allow markets to govern themselves. They are not able. If you allow human people pushed by greed to govern themselves, they will not install any rules because they're too greedy to do it. So government needs to actually control financial markets. This picture in slide 26 was precisely when the crisis collapsed, and this pensioner is saying with his board, missold, misled, miserable, because the collapse has created this misery in a lot of countries. So it is important that the markets have morality, because it is immoral to allow a market to manipulate people. And the church comes very clearly out in this document saying it is morally unacceptable. It is not simply to profit, but rather to avail oneself of inequality for one's own advantage in order to create enormous profits that are damaging to others. So it is unacceptable to allow profits and to allow inequality to damage other people. And the church says it is deplorable from the moral point of view when the intention of profit by a few through the risk of speculation, even if important funds of investment, provokes artificial reduction of prices of public debt securities without regard to the negative impact and the worsening economic situation of entire nations. Because there are people in markets who actually, through speculation, manage to cause the decline of share prices for them to buy them cheaply and then sell them more expensively. But in the reality, investors have lost money. And they are not the rich. Many times, the investors are pension funds and people who have saved something for their future who find that they have actually lost. So there is need for a radical reform, the Pope says, to be based on the principle that the rich are obliged to help the poor, that economic and financially favors human development, and that money must serve, not rule. And this document goes then into the detail of the market reforms that are needed in a lot of aspects. There are aspects that this document issued this year has not talked about because this market grows very quickly, like cryptocurrencies, which is another issue that would eventually can cause a lot of difficulties. But the church tried to come with a document that encourages the world to reform this system, which is unfortunately creating a lot of injustice globally and to a lot of people individually. Thank you for following this session.